not going to show up for attendees, and
Okay.
she's just a panelist.
Okay. So Sherry, right now you should only be seeing Todd and the two interpreters' windows. Is that correct?
Only
No,
Anne,
I can only see one interpreter. I can see Anne. That's it.
because she's spotlighted, and they're going to switch themselves every 15, 20
Okay, so there's only two webcams activated on
Right.
there right now. Okay. And in a moment you'll see mine. Do you want to activate me for a minute?
You can do it. Well, actually, maybe you can't. Okay, so I'll add a spotlight. Now you should be able to see Will. Is that correct?
You
Yes.
see me? Okay.
I
And
see
what I'm going to say to everybody at the beginning, I'm going to do the opening, and I think we'll just leave the slide on just as it is right now as our opening. I'll do the introduction, and then I'll also point to this area between this webcam photo and the PowerPoint and point out that right along this edge right here is a bar on which you as a participant can click to either expand the view of the interpreter or my webcam or the size of the PowerPoint. So by sliding that bar right here, one way or the other, you'll change the dimensions of these two displays.
Right.
Okay. Great.
Okay, looks like Daniel got the YouTube stream going.
What
Yeah,
I
so I
am
just got the stream going at a new URL, although it's interesting that it's got a USU logo branded down into the corner of it that I have no control over. So
that's okay. We're not showing this to anybody right now.
yeah.
I mean, if
What
it comes with chocolate ice cream, I'm not mad at that.
What I am not seeing. Okay.
The other thing I'm noticing about the stream is it's not following the spotlight settings. It's only showing whoever's talking. So that's going to be a problem.
Well, that's why we're doing an experiment.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be
that's right.
perfect. It's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a Zoom thing.
Yeah, it's definitely the problem with the Zoom recording system, but we were hoping the live stream system wouldn't have the same problem. Oh well, wishful thinking.
Okay, so the captions should be good to go, right, Daniel?
I saw, yeah, the captioner said that they were standing by a moment ago, I think.
Okay, and I have them. If anyone wants to see them, you click on the live transcript button on the bottom bar, and then do show subtitle, because they won't show up by default for presenters.
There's a hand raised in the waiting room.
Can I
Ellen
don't know if
Rhodes.
we can't begin to respond to every hand raised right now. I don't
She just
think.
asked if there's captions. I'll tell her.
Okay.
So, Will, when I'm presenting, are you expecting or do you want interaction with the participants to answer questions? Or you just want me to leave everything towards the end or?
Yeah, I think we should move forward as a solid presentation, and then we'll open up questions when you've wrapped up your remarks, and then we'll go through those questions sequentially.
Okay.
It also looks like the YouTube stream isn't broadcasting the subtitles either. Oh wait, now I got them to turn on. Okay. All right, so it does support subtitles at least, but not the spotlighting.
Are you only recording on Zoom or are you recording on something else?
We're recording with we're doing a screen capture on a
Okay.
guest machine.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Gunnar, is that looking okay on your side? Do you still need me to start a backup over here?
I will have you do it just in case, but let me go check on the other computer that's recording.
Okay, I've got this running in Zoom as a Zoom client right now, but I'll switch over. I've got this running in the YouTube stream right now, but I'll switch it over to Zoom and start the screen recording.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the YouTube now as well, and it doesn't seem to pin the videos, does it?
Okay, yeah, my recording looks good, Daniel.
Okay, good. I'll start mine just in case, but
Okay.
Good to know.
So have our participants have entered the room so far? Is that right?
Yeah, looks like we got 26.
I have 34.
29.
Weird.
Mine 37
Oh,
participants.
that's just total because there's 7 panelists and there were 30.
Oh, I
attendees.
see. Okay.
Can you make me back to a co-host so I can see the attendees?
Yeah.
So Anna, you can hear me.
Yes.
When I pop in and out, my camera does this jump thing. Let me see what happens when I spotlight myself again. Okay, so that's where I want it. If it does that, there we go. Don't know what that's about. That's new.
I mean, you're still in frame.
Yeah, it's still fine.
Yeah.
You see my lovely corner table and my box of rocks, but I mean,
So right now I am only seeing the interpreters, and I'm no longer seeing Todd or myself or anybody else. Is that correct, Gunnar?
It looks like his spotlight just got removed. I don't know if someone did that. I'll add it back.
Now I see Todd and Anna,
me too.
and now myself.
And just do whatever you did, but do it again when you edit your spotlight.
Okay.
Captioner wants to know if we want to be capturing all of this beforehand stuff or to wait until we start.
I messaged her privately, told her just
okay.
to start at the top of the hour.
You're on top of things. Okay, cool.
We're starting in 4 minutes, so I think it would be good to start captioning.
Okay, that's fine. Well, it worked that time, Ann, so I'll just keep an eye on it and I'll add the spotlights if something goes wrong.
Two.
So, am I on the screen right now for the participants to see? Am I pinned?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, for some reason, I am not seeing the captioning. Should I not be?
Did you click the live transcript button and do show subtitle?
I don't think they're typing right now.
Oh yeah, that's probably it. I'll message them.
Okay. So we are just about ready to get started with today's webinar. We're working out all of the details. You may have sensed that we are working with a new version of the Zoom webinar platform. So this is a a bit of a learning curve for some of us. So thank you for your patience and your tolerance with us as we work through some of these details. We're going to be starting here in just about 2 minutes. For now, you can just, if you need live captioning, you can click the live transcript or CC button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn on the captioning at the bottom of your screen. You'll also notice right over here, let me point right here, along this edge between the PowerPoint slide and the webcam images, there's a little bar that you are allowed to click on and slide to the left or right, and that will allow you to adjust the size of the webcam images and the PowerPoint slide. And so you can do that to your liking. So feel free to adjust those anytime. Once our presenter has completed his comments for today, we'll open up a chat box into which you'll be able to type your questions for our presenter today. But until then, we invite you to just have your focus solely on the content of our presenter's remarks and his slides.
Something went wrong.
Looks like you stopped your screen share, Todd, if you just want to start it up again.
Yeah, I got kicked out for some reason.
There we go. It's looking fine now.
And you guys can hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. So Todd, are you ready to get started? And if so, I'll do an introduction.
I'm ready when you are, Will.
Okay. All right. Well, good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar that is co-sponsored by the Maryland EHDI Virtual Conference and NCHAM, which is the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management. We're delighted to be doing this together. We're also here, and we appreciate your patience with us as we get adjusted to this new platform that we're using today. My name is Will Iserman, and I am with the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management, which houses the EHDI National Technical Resource Center. And we're really happy to be able to be working jointly with Maryland and making this webinar series available to everybody throughout the EHDI community nationally. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars. One was last week at the same time and day, and the next one will be next week at the same time. And so we invite you to attend again. These webinars are being recorded, so if anything disrupts your full participation in this webinar, or if you think of others who would benefit from this, go to infanthearing.org in the next couple of days where you'll find the recording of the webinar for you to review again and to share with others. Today, we want to give a call out to our interpreters and to our captioner, who is helping us make this webinar as accessible as possible. So we're always appreciative of the real people that are involved in these events, as well as more people than you probably can guess who are standing in the wings holding the technological threads of this event together. So these technical systems are stressed in a considerable way these days. So we ask for your patience if we have any disruptions or flaws in the delivery of this system today. Once our presenter has wrapped up his comments today, we'll be opening up a chat box, as I said, into which you'll be able to type in your questions for him to respond to. But for right now, you can just keep your focus on his content and his slides. I also want to point to the bar, which is a bar between this series of webcams and the display screen of the PowerPoint, where you'll find an ability to shift the size of the PowerPoint screen and the size of the webcam images. So if you'd like to adjust that, you're able to do that by clicking on the bar that is immediately in between these two series of images. So you can adjust that to your liking. Also, if you need closed captioning, if you click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen where it says live transcript, you can turn that on and off to your liking. So our presenter today is Dr. Todd Houston, who is a professor in the School of Speech Language Pathology and Audiology at the University of Akron, where he teaches courses and professional seminars related to phonetics, oral habilitation, professional issues, and telepractice. His primary interests of research include spoken language acquisition in children with hearing loss, serving the needs of parents in the intervention process, and telepractice as a service delivery model. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand it over to Todd. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Will. It's an honor to be with you guys today. And it's also an honor to be working with NCHAM and, of course, the Marilyn Eddy program. And thank you, Sherry Dowling, for inviting me to be a part of this. So we're going to talk about fathers and how do we engage fathers in their child's early intervention. And these are, of course, fathers of children with hearing loss. This has been an interest of mine for quite some time, and you'll see why it has been an interest of mine. And as we go through the presentation. As Will mentioned, we'll save most of the questions, all of the questions really, to the end. So if you have questions, write them down and be ready to submit those as we start to get towards the end of today's presentation. And we'll leave some time, ample time for everyone to be able to ask any questions they may have. So with that, and just a couple of disclaimers. I am currently receiving some royalties on 3 books I've done through Plural Publishing, and you see those there. And I am also a founding partner in the CEO of the 3C Digital Media Network. Something that I want to start my presentations with is that we recognize that children with hearing loss are, every child is different, every family is different, and those families need to have access to information and make decisions about what's best for their child and their family. That being said, my area of specialty or training has been in more of the listening and spoken language side of things. And so my presentation will focus on fathers that have chosen that methodology, although in some of the research that I will talk about that I did, we actually had fathers that utilized other communication modes as well. And so we'll focus on the listening and spoken language aspects only because I don't know enough about the rest to really have a say or to provide any information on that. But I, for one, certainly believe that options should be available for families, and families need to make those decisions based on what's they want for their child and what is right for their family. So with that, what do we want to focus on today? Well, we'll talk about some of those national trends in service delivery. What are we seeing right now? And how are those trends affecting parents of children with special needs, and especially fathers? We'll also discuss some of the unique roles that fathers play in their child's early intervention and overall child development. And we'll also get into some strategies that really foster greater parental and family engagement that come from fathers themselves. This is what they are saying that we need to do better as professionals. So, with that, let's start by first quickly defining the family. And I think what we will know today is that families come in all different sizes and shapes. And so, in today's family, we can have a more of a traditional family, mom, dad, two kids, as would be the stereotypical traditional family. But that's not how families are constructed these days. We're seeing all kinds of different um, types of structures, of family units that have come together as adults and children. And so we do see so many different ways that a family can become a family, a group of individuals that are together for a specific reason. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so how do we want to define the family? Well, we could actually define it using a dictionary. And what Webster says, a group of individuals living under one roof and usually under one head of household. Or you could have a group of people brought together by marriage or birth. But I like this third idea here, this third version of how we define the family. And it's those who eat at the common table. And those of us who, those people who are going to be sitting around each evening under the same house and under the same roof, usually, who are talking about, how they want to live their lives. They're talking about what's affecting their lives. They're, sharing and loving each other. That's really what it comes down to in terms of what is a family. Now, related to having a family, we know as early interventionists, we as professionals need to be family centered. But I think sometimes we continue to struggle with what that means exactly. And if we're going to do family centered early intervention or family centered services, then we have to respect and recognize the role of the family in their child's intervention. And we have to help families and help parents and caregivers really feel supported in how they are caring for their child and how they make decisions about what's best for their child and what's best for the family. And if we do this the right way, it is a partnership. It's a partnership where we see parents and professionals as equals in this process. I would probably say that parents probably have a little more weight than the professionals, to be honest, but it is a partnership where really the families need to be driving this bus, so to speak. And if we do this the right way, my goals for the child will be the same as what the parents want and what the caregivers want. Those goals and outcomes should be the same, should be interwoven. So that's where we want to go. I also believe that what the parents or the family's desired outcome, what they want to see happen with their child, should drive the intervention process. And so I think that comes back to us being family centered if we're truly going to be family-centered, then we need to discuss what those outcomes might be for the family, or what they have chosen those outcomes. And then we try to put an intervention plan around making that happen to the greatest extent possible. And so obviously that goes into how they want their child to communicate. And we also know, based on the research for 20 to 30 years now, that approximately 95% of those children are born to families, the parents that have typical hearing. And so more than likely families, those parents want to communicate with their children just the way that they communicate, and the way everyone else in the family communicates. And so we do see more and more families making that choice as a desired outcome. We also know, and this idea and this discussion of what is family centered, we also have to recognize that families do go through a great deal of emotions when they learn that their child has a hearing loss. Sometimes they may feel distanced from the child. Sometimes and often the diagnosis is unexpected. It's not something they were ever told could happen in many cases. We're doing a little bit better job than we used to in terms of sort of the prenatal education and trying to make sure families and expected mothers know what could happen, hearing loss being a part of that. But we still need to do a lot more in that area to make sure that families are fully informed about what could happen once they have children. But we also know that stress, and we're seeing a lot more data right now, a lot more studies looking at stress and conflict and those kinds of situations within the home and how that affects children. Regardless of it's a child with special needs or hearing loss or any other child, when you're in a very toxic environment, it's going to have an impact on that child's development. And so stress, we know, is a very normal part of life. But we also know that problems occur when we don't try to alleviate stress within the home. And if left unchecked, we know that those high levels of stress can lead to physical, cognitive, and even behavioral changes in the child. And so what we need to make sure is that sometimes the parent's initial reaction may be quite negative or quite they may be in denial, be very angry, but that's not how all families are going to react. Now, saying that, you know, based on where I've been for the past 25 or 30 years, I've seen all kinds of reactions to that first initial diagnosis of hearing loss in children. Uh, and so what I have seen over time is that, you know, sometimes we do see anger, sometimes we do see denial, sometimes we see a range of responses. Sometimes families have a little bit of sadness and they jump right in and start doing the intervention. And what I have seen and learned over time is that this idea that families are going to go through sort of this stair-stepped process of acceptance where they have to be in that denial stage, and then they have to be in the anger stage, and then they have to be in an acceptance until they reach final acceptance. Sometimes it gets presented that these stages are sort of one and done. Once they get through them, you go to the next one. And then they get through that one and they go to the next one. And then at the end of this process, then it's all fine. They fully accepted the child's hearing loss. In my experience, nothing could be further from the truth. What I have seen is that this idea of acceptance of a child's diagnosis is really an ongoing adaptation to that circumstance or that situation of having any child with special needs. And so we do see when there are transitional periods going from early intervention into preschool, preschool into public school, when if a child's hearing loss changes, they go from hearing aids to cochlear implants. Any transitional period can bring up all of these feelings once again. And so you may see anger, you may see sadness or depression, or you may see um, other emotional reactions at that transitional time. Because again, these emotions are quite raw and they're not just going to go away once you've gone through them. They'll keep coming up through these periods. So the transitional periods are very, very uh, much a part of this process, and so as children are getting older, we may need some additional help because these transitional periods can be quite stressful. Parents are dealing with the emotions, could be stressful on the child. And sometimes during those periods of times, we may have to get additional support for the family, whether it's counseling or other support that we can have access to, or that we do have access to, just to help the families get through that point in time. And when we see the diagnosis happening, we also see that parents, after the diagnosis, that their roles change and that they may have multiple roles. And certainly, we want to work with caregivers and parents and help them become sort of the models in terms of communication and language for their children with hearing loss. But then they also become sort of an advocate for their child. And that's a bit of a different role for a lot of families. They, again, it's something they weren't maybe expecting because this is the first time they've experienced hearing loss in their family. And so they have the diagnosis, they're dealing with that, and then they have to learn how to be an advocate for their child. And so when we see that parents who start this journey, they start to embrace the child's hearing loss and they start to hopefully see that all of the professionals working with the child and with the family, hopefully everyone is on the same page and that everyone is seen as a part of an overall team, an intervention team that's there to meet the parents' needs as well as the child's. So because of we're going to save our questions and reflections to the end of the presentation, I'm just going to keep going. And so the question comes back to family-centered early intervention and why do we want to partner with parents? Why do we want to really engage them in this process? You know, um, well, at the end of the day, we know that parents and caregivers are their child's first and best teachers, as it should be. And so we know that over the past 20 to 30 years, even longer, that there's research that really demonstrates the really significant impact that parents and caregivers in terms of their interactions, that those interactions have on the outcomes of the children with or without hearing loss. So how often are they engaging with their child and playing with their child and modeling language? Is that happening every day during those daily routines that we hope to see the parents do? And I know many of you may be familiar with the Hart and Risley research that was done, but it gets brought up quite often. But I think it's a good snapshot, basically showing that those families in more affluent households are basically speaking and using more words with their child than those children in the lower socioeconomic status, or in those households. And those in sort of the middle income are kind of in the middle there. But from the most affluent down to the lowest in terms of socioeconomic status, there's about a 30 million word gap. And this research was done with typical developing kids. This is not kids with hearing loss. And so if you think about, by the time these children enter, kindergarten, we'll say that those children from the most affluent families versus the children from the poorer families, a 30 million word gap between how many words those more affluent kids have heard versus the language and how much has been modeled for those children in the lower levels, lower socioeconomic levels. So it means that we essentially have to do more to make sure parents understand the importance of their role in developing language and communication. That's really what it comes down to. And it shouldn't be about economics. It shouldn't be about, the more wealthy families versus the more middle class or the lower socioeconomic families. We should really try to strive to have a system where all families get the same amount of information, that they then are able to do the same level of input in terms of language and number of words spoken, regardless of educational or socioeconomic background. So maybe that's a little bit of a perfect world thinking for me, but I think we need to keep trying to see if we can make that happen. And so what we found from that Hart and Risley study, some key findings there, was IQ and language through later testing with the children was related to how much of the parent-child directed language occurred. So the parent-child interactions, basically. So what it sort of boils down to is that the more parents talk to the children, the faster the vocabulary growth and greater language growth and IQ scores later on, and when they were retested. And then we also know from that study, as well as other studies that are out there now, that academic success at age 9 to 10 is linked to the amount of talking, again, vocabulary, how many words heard, from birth to 3. And so if we really want to predict more success at age 9 and 10, we have to have the language input from birth to 3. And so that's really what it boils down to. But we do see a widening gap. And as I just mentioned, when you start to look at how many words per hour and how many discouragements that they found in the research, it comes down to, again, when you think about 14-hour days, about a 30 million word gap and 144,000 encouragements, a gap of 144,000 encouragements versus discouragements based on, again, socioeconomic status. So again, more work has to be done. So you look at other research that's out there, and you look at the quality of the language interactions. And some of the best predictors of language skills at age 3 comes back to the quality of interactions involving words, the use of shared symbols, and conversational fluency. So again, how parents interact with their child helps to lay that foundation for learning and language as we go forward. And so again, this is why we have to do more to make sure families have the skill sets and have the information to make this happen. And beyond that, we have to also, as professionals, get into more comfort level of modeling to the parents the way this should happen. And I think we're still struggling. Some professionals still struggle with how do we model these behaviors with parents? How do we coach them? How do we help parents develop these skills and be really strong uh, language models for their children or communication models for their children? There's still a great deal of struggle around that. So what we can also look at based on some of these studies is that the amount and quality of language addressed with the child is more predictive of the child's language skills and IQ than socioeconomic status or parent education. So we have to do more and more to make sure we level the playing field for these families and these children. And so one of the studies that I like to go back to, that's one of those seminal studies for me that reinforces this in terms of children with hearing loss, goes back to what Mary Pat Moeller did in 2000. And she looked at the impact of early intervention factors on language outcomes at age 5. And what she found was the degree of hearing loss did not predict how these children would do later on by age 5. It was really significant. The age of enrollment was a significant predictor. So the earlier, the better. The earlier that we can identify these children with hearing loss, get them in early intervention, get them fitted with amplification and into early intervention, and then the degree of family involvement and engagement really explain most of the variance in the data. And so really came down to the earlier we start and the earlier we start helping families be engaged with their child is going to set that child up for more success. And that's really what Mary Pat found. And again, we looked at a different study from 2013 with Quickner. And this was with children with cochlear implants. And again, parent behaviors predicted the language gains 4 years later. And so high parent sensitivity, cognitive and linguistic stimulation meant a 1.5 years greater language gains in the children. So again, research going back a couple of decades up to the day basically is showing the more the parents can engage with their child and reinforce language and communication, and that is in coordination with early intervention and early identification and early fitting of hearing technology, then the better off these children are going to be. And of course, what we need to focus on as well is if we can identify these children early on, then our goal is that we want to follow more of a developmental approach. And today, with newborn hearing screening and early intervention, we can do that in most cases. But at the same time, there are children that don't get the best services. There are children who have other issues, or families move, or families come from other countries. A lot of factors that come into play where the child isn't going to be able to follow a developmental approach, and then it becomes more of a remedial approach. But if we can do this the right way and follow that developmental approach, then we can focus on that child really being in developmental synchrony. So acquiring those developmental milestones when other hearing children same age is acquiring them, so in synchrony with typical development, then we'll follow that developmental approach. And again, we're seeing more and more families today and children today having the ability to do that. And this is a quick illustration of that if you look to the left of the slide, you'll see developmental approach and birth. So if we can follow that developmental approach from birth, then we can probably stay with that until the child goes into kindergarten, first grade. If we don't start until the child is, age 2 or age 3, then if you go straight up, then the longer you wait to start this approach or to start providing these kinds of services, the more remediation you may have to do. And it's not impossible for kids who start a little bit older. What I mean older today means 2 or 3. It's not impossible for those kids to be successful with listening and spoken language, but it just makes it a lot more difficult in terms of the intervention, in terms of the teaching and what needs to occur. So it then becomes more remediation, or a combination of remediation and developmental approaches. And as we were just talking about, my colleague, Cheryl Dixon, basically said, in terms of intervention, or in terms of therapy, if you think about therapy or intervention, it is to synchronize the child's developmental age to the chronological age. And often when we work with these children and start, if we can start on that developmental approach, and they can stay right within that sequence of when typical developing kids are achieving those milestones. Those kids who start a little bit later, or for different reasons, there's a gap between their hearing age and their chronological age, then the goal is to help them get caught up and to be synchronized. There are kids that can make significant progress. I've had children make, 16, 18 months of progress in a 12-month period of time. So they get to a point where they're catching up and getting closer to their chronological age in terms of their development. And I've seen children do even better than that. But everyone has to be on the same page, working together with the family, with the audiologist, with the interventionist, listening and spoken language therapists, whoever's working with the child and the family. They all have to be on the same page with the same desired outcomes in mind. So when we think about building this setting, this situation for children to learn language and to really respond, we know that language is learned when someone who adores you is playing with you, in the course of play, during those caregiving routines, and in daily life. If we can help families really keep the hearing technology throughout all waking hours, and then turning everything, almost every interaction, knowing how to use those interactions to really reinforce listening and spoken language, that's going to be optimal. But they also have to understand how to adapt, the families and the caregivers, that is. They have to understand how to adapt sometimes what they're doing to make sure the child is going to listen and respond appropriately. So as we were just saying, language intervention really is happening all waking hours, just like wearing the hearing technology. And as my colleague Jane Medell talks about, eyes open, ears on. So if the child is awake, then hopefully they are wearing their hearing technology, whether they're hearing aids or cochlear implants or one of each. And so families are the key, caregivers and parents are the key for these children to be successful. And again, we have to really focus our skills on maximizing the parents' skills. I'm a little less concerned. This may sound kind of strange, but when I get an infant in to work with, because I'm at Akron Children's Hospital a couple days a week working with families, and when we have an infant come in who's maybe a month or 2 month old, I'm less worried about the child than I am about the parents. I want to get them engaged. I want to start talking to them about expectations, but I want to do that in a way that's supportive and positive. And then I know if we can do that and give the parents the skill sets and the knowledge to be those language facilitators, then I know the child is probably going to do pretty well. So we have to start and end with the parents and just about everything. So what are some of the pioneers have said about working with families and working with parents? Those of you may know the actor Spencer Tracy, or his wife, Louise Tracy, founded the Tracy Speech and Hearing Clinic or Center out in Los Angeles, as you probably know. Also developed one of the first correspondence courses for families. And so when a child was identified with hearing loss, she would send them information about hearing loss, and they would get monthly mailings at that point from John Tracy. And so Louise and Spencer Tracy had a son, John, who was deaf. And so she set up that center to be a resource, and that center still is in operation today. Ken Moses is a psychologist and parent, and he works with a lot of families who go through grief. And David Luderman is someone I've always looked up to in terms of how he's approached working with families of kids with hearing loss. And just as David was saying or has said, if you take care of the parents, the children will turn out fine. And I mostly agree with that. If we really focus on supporting the families, giving them the tools, then by extension, the children are usually going to be better. And so that is where we have to focus, providing that emotional support, understanding and supporting through this grief process that we've talked about. And when we can, facilitating more parent to parent and family to family interaction so that they can meet other parents who are going through the same thing, that have kids with hearing loss, meet other parents, meet other families to see how they are adapting. Ken Moses talked about, sort of this idea of shattered dreams, that when that diagnosis happens for the hearing parent, most they do grieve sort of this loss that they thought was there, this expected life before the diagnosis that they had, and then once the diagnosis, they grieve for that life that they thought the child was going to have. And so it is been identified or being compared to a loss of someone who's very close to you. But I think we have to help the families understand that there is hope. There is methodologies today. There is a way to work with the child, and that really these kids don't have many limits. I'm not saying that they don't have limits, but that there's lots that can be done, and these children can have very successful lives and have language and communication outcomes that really do rival their hearing peers. And sometimes these families who are dealing with for the first time have no knowledge of what the positive outcomes can look like until they really start understanding how we can work with families today and how we can work with children today. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the points in the next few slides, just mainly because we've touched on a lot of this already. When we think about this idea of feelings and the emotions that families go through, it is quite messy. No family is the same. Sometimes you have, where I had, for example, a mother and a father with their son not too long ago. The mother was, as my son would say, was very chill. She kind of understood what was going on. She was, I'm sure experiencing a lot of emotions, but she was, very focused on what do we do next? How do we make this happen? This is, give me all the information. We had great conversations. Where her husband had a very angry, very, very angry reaction to the child's diagnosis, to why do we have to put, asking lots of questions about why do I have to put hearing aids on the child if we're going to get cochlear implants? Why do we need to do this? This is just a big, hindrance or an impact on a negative impact on my family to have to keep putting the hearing aids on. I don't want to do that. I mean, just really, really negative about the whole thing. And when we talk about, putting hearing aids on, trying to stimulate, as much audition as possible. He was like, well, the audiologist said he was, my child was deaf. Why do I put hearing aids on? Let's just get the implants now and all this. So it was quite one of the more difficult conversations that I had to keep coming back to with this father. And so he's going to be different from the next father who comes along and the next family that comes along. So it can be messy, even between spouses. And of course, when you get into situations where there's divorce and other strains on the marriage, where one spouse wants to do something, and of course, in some of the more messy situations, the spouse wants to do the opposite. And it may not be what's in the best interest for the child, and the child gets lost in the shuffle sometimes. But I think what we have to do is realize that we can't fix every situation. We have to sometimes be a good listener and focus on supporting families and letting them sometimes just share what they are concerned about. Sometimes they just want someone to listen to them and validate that the way they're feeling is appropriate, or is natural. And so we can't fix everything, and I think we have to be upfront, and show families we can't. Here are those stages that we typically see when we talk about grieving stages and their functions. So I'm sure you've been exposed to all of this a lot in other ways, other presentations and other readings you've done. So I'm just going to go on a little bit. What we do, based on some of the research, is that when a caregiver is experiencing grief, which is the following grieving states is the hardest for you as a practitioner. And of course, denial was one of the hardest things for us as practitioners to deal with, that they just don't want to recognize that there is a hearing loss. And again, I've seen it with fathers where the mom is all in because the mom is coming to the therapy sessions and doing the intervention at home and doing all these things. And the father is less involved and really denying that it really needs to happen. Why do we really need to put hearing aids on? I think he's hearing just fine. And so there's that denial that sometimes does occur. Again, we talk about how life sort of is about ongoing adjustment and adaptation. So we talked about earlier some of the sort of touch points when we may see some of the grieving or some of the emotions that come out of it. And so you see the list there. So for the sake of time, I won't go through all of those. But again, any testing that happens at school is another opportunity for those emotions to come out. If there's just frustration of getting good services, obviously there's going to be some emotion to that. And what I sometimes hear families talk about is that, oh, here's a family that's had a second child with hearing loss. And almost as if, they don't need the same level of support or understanding that they're going to go through the same kind of grieving process as they did with the first child. Even though that they're obviously more aware that hearing loss could occur now, but it's still a grieving process. It can still be quite emotional. And I think we sometimes as professionals think, oh, they're going to be fine because they've already gone through this once. They know exactly what to do. I think we need to reevaluate that a bit because they need the space to grieve what's going on with the second child, maybe before we start talking about, you know, what comes next. So how do we support grieving families? Being enough, being empathetic, non-judgmental, being unconditional in our support, and helping them feeling focused on intervention and making sure that we are focused on providing the what the families have requested or want for their child. So much of this is sort of getting some feedback from parents about what they want in terms of from professionals. Uh, what comes up a great deal is being able to meet other parents, of course, being able to meet other families. What are some of the online resources and online groups? There's so many now, like Facebook groups that families can join, and other online kinds of resources. And another way of thinking about this is, you know, listening to families. We know what works there, empathizing with them, validating that it's okay to feel the way they are, and offering resources and assistance when we can. So I'm going to jump on over and talk about fathers. So just as a introduction to this is research that I've been doing for a number of years, gathering data on fathers. And these are fathers of children with hearing loss. And trying to get really more into what is that experience like for fathers in general when the child has a diagnosis that they're dealing with. And then how do fathers perceive their role in this early intervention process, and how do they respond to professionals, and then how do professionals respond to them are some of the areas that I've tried to look at with some of the research. And I actually started doing some of this research when I was at Utah State University, where NCHAM is located, obviously, and many of the folks involved in this presentation behind the scenes are located. But I've continued to collect data on fathers. And so I'm excited to share what I found so far. So when we think about fathers, I really want to think about, you know, intact families versus non-intact family in terms of how that is defined often in the literature. So intact families are really the biological father and biological mother either living together or married. Not intact, the biological father and biological mother are either divorced, separated, or the biological father or other male influence is non-existent. Again, these are not terms that I came up with, but some that are in the literature about intact versus not intact. What we also see when we think about parents more generally is what are the parenting styles that we may run into. And there are certainly lots of different sort of descriptive profiles that we could use when we examine parenting styles and behavior management and all of those kinds of things. And so the way we sort of look at this from one perspective is what's called demandingness. How demanding is the parent, and then the responsiveness, how responsive they are and how demanding they are. And so that's some of the things that we look at. And so the other way to look at this is looking at responsiveness and affect. So what we're really talking about here is the amount of support and affection a parent displays toward their child. And we know that it is associated with predicting more social competence and psychosocial development. In other words, the more affectionate, the more responsiveness the parent is, the better the child is going to be. When the parent is not as responsive to the needs of the child, children start to associate with more deviant peers or deviant influences and show greater levels of externalizing behaviors. So again, more and more research goes into how we work with families, how we work with parents to help these children be more successful. We also know that hostile and neglectful parenting styles are often associated with aggression, deviant behaviors, and adjustment problems in their children, where warm and responsive parenting styles predict more social competence and cooperative behavior. When we look at the research in a very general sense, we usually see, and this is not, again, this is just from large bodies of research looking at parenting roles. This doesn't mean it happens in every family or every family is set up this way. But when we look at sort of the general roles that get defined, mothers usually take on more of a custodial or routine caregiving roles, where the father tends to be more in social stimulation and interactive activities. And so you see sort of the division of responsibilities, so to speak, start to happen a bit. We also know that the availability of the father and the involvement of the father is associated with more or better academic success, as well as social, emotional, and cognitive well-beings and those school-age children. So again, the more we do earlier, helping fathers be more involved, the better we see these children are later on and more adjusted they become. So what we also see is that more frequent and regular contact with the fathers is really associated with more intense relationships and fewer adjustment problems in children. So again, there is a great deal that fathers bring to the table. So why is the father-child relationship important? Well, since 1960, the number of births to unmarried mothers has increased by 6 times. Fathers may act as a buffer to children whose mothers are at high risk. And again, I'm not here to say that single parent homes where there's a single mother that children are automatically going to have adjustment issues. I'm just saying, based on the research, this is what we're seeing across large numbers of families and situations where fathers are involved versus fathers are not involved. So every family, again, is going to be different. And so I just want to make sure everyone is clear. And so even in intact families, the level of father-child engagement decreases with age. We also see a father's earnings have a negative effect on the level of involvement with their children during the week. So the more they earn, the less interactions they have, basically. And sometimes you see it in the opposite direction. So there's a little bit of a mixed study with that, mixed outcomes. So this idea of fathers and early intervention, what do we do? How do we work with them? This is really personal for me. And you can see the picture there on the left is when I had more hair, just slightly more than I have now. But this is my daughter, Caitlin, who was born 27 years ago. And she was born at 26 weeks gestation, weighing 1 pound, 12 ounces at birth. And my wife, I should say, Caitlin's mother, is a speech language pathologist as well. We met in graduate school at the University of South Carolina. So we both knew, the developmental aspects of children, and knew, some of the potential issues that we could be facing once we knew that she was going to be born so early. So we were trying to prepare ourselves because we had some knowledge of disability and different diagnoses. That doesn't mean we still didn't face a real challenge with dealing with this early arrival, this premature daughter. What I can say more positively is, we went into sort of what we call beast mode, and really started stimulating her while she was still in an incubator in the hospital, in the neonatal intensive care unit. We would sing to her, we would talk to her, we would do everything we could that was allowed to stimulate her and make sure she was getting the input that we want. And so over time, she was in the hospital for 67 days. She came home when she would have been born if she had been full term. So she was in there 67 days and came home weighing about 4.5 pounds, I think. So still very small. Met all of the developmental norms. The only residual thing that really came up was some scoliosis of her spine. She had a complete S curve. If you think about the letter S, that was what her spine looked like. Complete S curve in her spine. So at age 11, she had a rod on each side of her spine and 18 screws to straighten her spine. So that was a major surgery. And then a little bit later on, I think unrelated to her prematurity, she did have a benign tumor on her liver that was removed. And so what do we have today? Well, she goes off and gets married this past summer. And very happy for her and her husband, Ian. But this was from actually this past June. She got married. So she's doing quite well. She did finish high school and went into the nursing program here at the University of Akron. And she is now a school nurse down in Florida. And her husband teaches middle school in the same school district. And she continues to do quite well. So very proud of her. She's one is a survivor who did quite well in terms of her development. But when she was diagnosed and came home, we got early intervention services. And so I noticed very early on that the interactions that were going on between the early interventionist and my wife was much more supportive, much more natural than they were with me. And we were parents where, every session that we had in the home, we were both involved. And so there were situations where, only my wife got information, or I was kind of, it was obvious that, the person came in and was speaking with my wife, and then I was kind of sitting off to the side and wasn't really engaged or being engaged in whatever was happening. So there was those kinds of issues that I noticed early on with my daughter, and that kind of experience that I had as a father has sort of stuck with me over the years and kind of informed my own interest in this area. When we look at research on fathers and fathers' involvement in their children in terms of being role models and being language facilitators, you have to take a step back, because a lot of research, when we look at communication outcomes, a lot of research is geared towards the mother, sort of the mother's educational level, the mother's feelings, the amount of bonding that goes on between the child and the mother. And so there's a lot of variables that are measured in a lot of studies that involve the mother. And it's assumed that the mother is always going to be involved, whether the father is there or not. And so there's a little bit of a bias, I think, and when we look at the research, that they're not also looking at the father's educational level, the father's issues. And so it's sometimes hard to find a lot of research that focus specifically on fathers. As you sort of go through the research that is available, you start to see some patterns, and where fathers are described as the secondary parent, the peripheral parent, and in one study, the imaginary parent. And so when we look further, when we think about fathers and their roles, a lot of research focuses on more of what we'd call the parental pathologies. So the abusive fathers, the fatherlessness, so single parenting with a mom, but the father is out of the picture. And then certainly deadbeat dads, so dads who are not supporting the family or not consistently supporting the family. And so you have this dichotomy almost where fathers are seen as more of a pathology, and then a lot of research is tied to variables related to the mother. And so it's very interesting when you start to look at all of the research that's been done over the past 20 to 30 years, especially. Now, more recently, we are starting to see more research looking at fathers, and not from that pathological perspective, but actually looking at how fathers are enrolled in early intervention and how they are being served in these situations when they have children with special needs. And so it's not sort of a coming at it from a negative perspective, but more just gathering data on both mothers and fathers. And so when we think about other aspects of fathers, there was a great survey of about 1,600 fathers and families looking at fathers' involvement and the subsequent emotional, behavioral, and cognitive and learning outcomes of their children. And so this was from 0 to 3, that organization. And so what they found is that fathers have been shown to strengthen early development by helping their children acquire problem-solving skills. That was something that came up, that will come up in the research that I did, was that the mindset of many fathers is that, oh, this has happened, I've got to find a way to fix it. And so this has happened to my family, like getting a diagnosis of hearing loss. So they go into this mindset of, it's my responsibility to fix the problem. I need to take this problem away. And so how can I do that? But that's another topic in a few minutes. But they help these children learn and acquire problem-solving skills, exhibit persistence skills when faced with challenges. So the mindset of keep going, don't give up, feel secure enough to explore the world around them. The children have greater tolerance for stress when fathers are involved, and they develop greater confidence in their own abilities and their own thoughts. And when we focus in more specifically on children that have special needs and the role of the father, we know that, again, fathers want to be creative and try to have again, problem solve the situation. And sometimes they maybe see their role as being creative and trying to figure out a way to intervene or design a better system or design a better way, because they feel, again, they're approaching it from a problem solving perspective, and they do best when they are engaged with solving the problem. Again, that comes up often in the research. And we know that fathers have just as intense emotions as their spouse might have when they receive a diagnosis. Some fathers may have what we call the John Wayne approach. They don't want to show the emotion. They don't want to be seen, being upset or crying in front of the professionals, or they want to be strong for their wife and vice versa. But it doesn't mean if a father sort of has a flat affect, it doesn't mean that they're not on the inside really struggling. So we have to be careful in terms of how we interpret what may be going on. And so what we are seeing, though, with more of the sort of modern trends that we have now, that there's more of a shared responsibility between husband and wife, between spouses, within relationships. In other words, it's not sort of the stereotypical 1950s, dad goes to work, mom's a homemaker, but there's more two parents working out of the home, sharing responsibilities with the child and going up to appointments, those kinds of things. And so we are seeing changes in that area. So what we did in the current study and what we are continuing to add to this database is that we had a 47 question survey that was distributed to fathers throughout the United States. And these, again, fathers of kids with hearing loss. There was a similar study that was done in the United Kingdom on a very small set of fathers, about 30 fathers, a number of years ago. And so I took that sort of survey and adapted it and expanded it, basically. And so what we wanted to look at was, one, do fathers feel adequately included in support services and in the early intervention process? Two, how can professionals include and involve fathers in their child's services? And do fathers feel that their child's hearing loss has had a negative effect on their relationship with their child? So those were the three primary questions that we used. We use SurveyMonkey. We're about ready to use a different system going forward, but we were able to use SurveyMonkey with a link, and we distributed that survey through lots of different organizations online, different social media. And of course, we were able to download everything into Excel, do some analysis, and you'll see what happens. So we had also quite a few paper surveys that also included the link to the online survey. So we had 51 returned in terms of the paper surveys. We worked with the AG Bell Association. They sent things out. Again, we posted on social media. Hands and Voices also posted on their website. And so we ended up with 262 complete surveys. And so when we started to look at the data, we found that the majority of fathers that responded were in that 31 to 40-year-old age group. And then you see it broken down from there. In terms of ethnicity, 89% were Caucasian families or fathers. And then you see the other ethnic groups that we had, African American, Hispanic or Latino, American Indian, Asian, and then other we grouped in one. The primary communication in the home was English, spoken English. And then you see it divided out a bit more from there. Highest level of education of the fathers. By far, 35% were 4-year college degree fathers. The next highest going down was the 14%, which was some college. And then you had 23% that were master's degree, and then up from there. When we look at household income, 24% was, again, this is household, this is mothers and fathers, totals. About a fourth was in the 76 to 100,000. Another fourth or so was 101 to 150,000 combined incomes or household income. And then about 22% even higher. So we recognize that this survey was reaching more families that had middle class to upper middle class household incomes. We also looked at the time of diagnosis or age of diagnosis of the child. And so what was good to see of those responses that we got, that 43% said that their child was diagnosed with hearing loss and from birth to 3 months, in that range. And then you see a smattering of others. About 8%, 4 to 6, and then it gets a little bit higher as it goes up from there. So again, almost half of the fathers surveyed, universal newborn hearing screening is working. These kids were getting diagnosed fairly early. The current age of the child, the largest group that we had responding was 25%. So about a fourth of these fathers had children that were in that 3 to 5 age range. And then you see about another fourth was about at least 35 months or below. So over half were from birth to about age 5. So when we looked at the type of hearing loss, we had about 97% of those who responded had the child had bilateral hearing loss, both ears. And then when we looked at hearing levels in both ears, again, about the same in both ears. So about 55% profound in both ears, and it broke down from there. The child's main form of communication. So 82% reported spoken language, 11% reported American Sign Language, and then 7% described more of a total communication approach. So then we started to look at specific questions about the services these fathers received. And what we found was we set this up looking at strongly agree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree, or not applicable. And so it was a Likert scale that we, in a sense, asked fathers to respond to. And so when we sort of broke this out, if you look at the bottom of strongly agree, almost half of the fathers said that they felt included with that initial diagnostic, initial audiological evaluation of their child. And another 26% agreed with that. So overwhelming, close to 75% said they were included in the child's initial initial audiologic evaluation. And so that's 75%, but we still have about 14% that were either neutral or disagreed or strongly disagreed that they were included. So that's still too high. Do they feel that the professional's sensitivity, do they in a sense, experience professionals' sensitivity to the father's feelings when explaining the diagnosis. Again, we see a little bit lower here, 35% strongly agree, another 29% agree. So that's what, around 65% either agree or strongly agree that the professional was sensitive to their feelings. But we still have another fourth of them were either neutral or disagreed or strongly disagreed. So we're still seeing similar numbers. About a fourth of the fathers are not feeling supported in this process. Then we get into another question: were fathers given appropriate information regarding communication options? Again, we're seeing pretty high numbers, around what, 60% saying yes, they were given, they agree with that statement, or strongly agreed that they were given information about communication options. But again, another 35% or so are saying more neutral to that, or disagree, or strongly disagree. So maybe they received the information and didn't read it and don't recall it. Maybe the spouse received the information and instead of the father. So who knows exactly what went on there. But there's a difference that these fathers were feeling that maybe they didn't get that information. Fathers were given an appropriate amount of information about hearing technology. And so again, we're still seeing about 70% saying yes, looks good. But another 26% or more neutral to strongly disagree. So about 24%, still about a fourth of the families, or excuse me, a fourth of the fathers maybe feeling they didn't get enough information. So the question is, fathers have an active role in decision making. And you see, this is the one chart that I have, after 28 years of marriage, these fathers seem to strongly agree that they have an active role in decision making. I'm at the point where I'm just, whatever you want to do, honey, is fine with me. So, but in this situation, they felt that they had a good, that they were part of the decision-making process. And so we then started to look at more specifically what was going on with the fathers and their involvement in different appointments and therapy sessions. So fathers have been specifically invited to appointments and therapy sessions, including being in the home or outside the home. And we still see, probably 70%, close to 80%, 70%, excuse me. Again, agreeing to strongly agree, but about 30% was more neutral to that or disagreed. So 70% saying they've been invited, but again, 30% saying no, haven't been invited specifically. So this is a father that I worked with a little while back, but I think what he has to say still is relevant today. And so you will hear him talk about his wife, and he'll talk about the school district. What he means is the early intervention folks that were coming into the home. And so he's talking about his role being a father of a child that has bilateral hearing loss, profound sensorineural hearing loss, and how he was perceived and how he perceived the professionals. So let's take a listen.
Concerns are, what the concerns of the professionals are. So I think professionals probably need to be even more hands-on with the father. they probably need to make specific appointments to say, okay, Father, do you realize that research shows that you have an important role? Do you realize that your impact is different than the impact of your wife? Do you realize that your relationship with your child is an important predictor of your child's success in the society? And help them realize the role that they have. I think most parents probably don't appreciate the fact that the father, despite his significant absence in the home due to his need to provide for his family in a traditional sense, they don't understand how important the father's role is. I don't think I did. Maybe even now I underestimate what the father's role is. So that means that the practitioner, the professional, is going to have to give the father some pretty specific instruction. Pretty specific. And maybe even ask the father, how much time do you realistically expect to give? And if the father says, well, right now I hadn't thought about that, well, then let's sit down and look at your schedule. And maybe they could give some advice about, you probably need at least this many minutes in a given session to make some progress. Here's a good recommendation. 10 minutes with this kind of activity. As he gets older, maybe 15 minutes. Can you carve out this much? And help the father set some goals. Guide him through what would be a reasonable, so he feels like what he's doing is contributing and that he's just not there, floating with the process, but he has some specific assignments that perhaps maximize his role. If a practitioner knows that role of the father, then that practitioner can give the father specific assignments that leverage that relationship. And then asking the father, how often do you expect to be able to come? There are certain times we're going to need your input, or we want your input, and then just simply ask the father, when can you be here? I think there are a lot of meetings that occur that where the professionals are used to working with my wife, for example, in my particular situation. When I am at home, they never invite me to sit down. They never invite me to come participate. They don't have any questions for me. They just politely introduce themselves and then wait for me to walk to the office or walk outside or do something like that. But really, they could give me some assignments, and likely that would increase maybe the efficiency associated with my involvement.
When you've had those situations where you may have a professional coming to your home, and you're at home, and they introduce themselves, but then sort of turn around and start talking to your wife, how does that make you feel?
Well, in that case, I think, well, they must have what they need, or they must not value what I have to say, or they must not think I have anything different to say than my wife has to say. And all of that could be true. I don't know, because I don't know what specifically they came to ask for. But yeah, it is interesting. They seem to acknowledge me as the dad, but they don't seem to acknowledge me as a team player pertaining to my son. Maybe that's it. They say hello and they greet because I'm the head of household, perhaps, and because I'm there and I'm another adult and we're professionally trained, right, to introduce ourselves. But I don't sense that they value me as a team player in those situations. Yeah.
Interesting. So those are some situations where you've felt excluded from the process.
Yeah, certainly. The particular group is the school district, the people who are either contracted by the school district to come or those who represent the school district and they come to my home. That particular group has never reached out to me, ever. And so when they come, I'm just another person in the house. Yeah.
You're a piece of furniture in the house.
A piece of furniture, yeah. And that's not to say maybe I should have been more assertive.
So that was one father's perspective. Again, he was mentioning school district. What he meant by that was the early intervention services that were provided in the home. And so we continue on with the research, and it said, we asked them, were the fathers able to attend most support meetings or therapy sessions where important information was given? Again, around 63% said they agreed or strongly agreed. But again, more fathers were saying, well, no, I wasn't able to do that, or they're more neutral on that, or they can't do that. But they do offer, in a few minutes, you'll see some suggestions for us as professionals. The fathers, are they choosing to miss work for their child's appointment? And again, I certainly understand there are some jobs that fathers have that they can't miss work or they can't just take time off for different reasons. And so you start to see more of a spread here. Again, still what's pretty high number, 60% say yes, they can do that. But then you start to see more neutral and disagreement with the ability for them to do that. And so as we started to go through the results and really start to analyze what they said, we also included aspects within the survey and opportunities where the fathers could submit comments and talk about their experiences. And so what we did was to sort of list all those comments and what they were basically pertaining to. And then we kind of divided them up into different areas. We saw different trends that were happening. So what we saw, excuse me, when fathers did respond, providing comments, they talked about satisfaction with inclusion. They also talked about ways to include fathers, flexibility of appointments, offering some ways to change the characteristics of professionals and how the professionals interact. And they also talked about professionals providing parental education. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. And so we also asked, how can professionals include and involve fathers? And we asked them, if meetings were scheduled at the start or the end of the day, would they be easier to attend? And you see the spread. Some fathers said yes, others were more neutral, and then quite a few said no, that wouldn't be easier based on their work schedules. We also asked if they had a guide showing important meetings and how that guide would help them prioritize which meetings to attend. Again, we see 65% said that would be helpful, but then others, more neutral, and then others strongly disagree. Would video recordings or write-ups of meetings that the fathers would miss, would that help them feel more included? Again, we saw 63% saying yes or strongly agreed that having that kind of recording that they could watch later or having write-ups of the meetings, that would help them feel more included. Others are more neutral. They probably have never gotten those in the way that we worded the question, so they didn't know exactly if it would help them or not. And then others disagreed. So we also asked, fathers who would attend support groups specifically for fathers of children with hearing loss, would they be open to that? And I was kind of surprised about this response rate here. Only about 48% said that they would agree to that. Others are more neutral or strongly disagreed. And I think they're more neutral because maybe they just have never experienced a support group with fathers of kids with hearing loss before. And so they probably just don't know what to expect, is how I would interpret that. Another question was, was the communication with the child, is it fairly easy? And the hearing loss does not impact the father-child relationship. Again, 73% said, yes, that's true, or strongly agreed. And then we had more of a spread, about 27% saying more neutral or yes, it did impact. So concluding the study, what we found, and the fathers did provide a lot of recommendations. So I'm just going to go through some of those, but you can read them in the handouts. overall, as you can see from so many fathers who either agreed or strongly agreed, overall, the majority of fathers reported satisfaction with their level of inclusion and involvement. They reported or perceived that professionals had invited them to attend meetings and therapy sessions, that they attended the most important appointments, and that they were included and involved during support services, and that they had an active role in decision making. And for the sake of time, I won't read through all of some of the comments that we pulled out, but they are certainly there for you to read. So what were some of these suggestions that came out of the data? Fathers talked about having phone consultations. So if they're not able to be there in person, can they get a phone consultation about the meeting or get updated about what happened at a meeting afterwards on the phone? Can they get access to more emails and blogs? Can they get access to fathers only appointments? And so what we've really found with some of the responses was that basically what fathers were saying was don't assume that their spouse has told them everything or shared all of the results or shared the reports or shared everything that you've said. And sometimes there may be other issues with how the spouse is maybe doing certain things or keeping the amplification on or whatever, and they would rather meet with you without their spouse. So that was an interesting point that many of the fathers made is don't make assumptions that I'm automatically getting information just because you give it to my spouse. And there may be it may be necessary to have a situation where it's only me coming in with my child. They often talked about the interactions that professionals had. That they often, focused on the wife or the mother, but not the father. So even just eye contact was better with the mom than with the dad or with the father. And as you heard from that video, from that father, some of that as well, but also teaching fathers what is to be expected. So giving them, in a sense, a roadmap of what comes next. This is where we need you, kind of like what the father was talking about in that video. And you can see his background is more of an engineering background. So he very much wants to know specific things to do, how to do them, how long to do them. And so some fathers may want that level of instruction or that level of feedback. Giving them permission to ask questions. And so this came up with one of my fathers that I work with, and so at the end of every session, I try to ask fathers, okay, do you have any questions? And that's just a part of how I've always done things. And so as I'm wrapping up a session with a family, with a father, I'll ask both mom and dad, do they have any questions for me? And so this one father who would bring his son to see me, I would always ask at the end. We would sort of review what had happened in the session, talk about what to work on at home. We'd talk about what we're going to work on next time they come in, and kind of review all of that. And then I would say, do you have any questions? And he always said no. And so later on, I was doing some work with him, and he kind of pulled me aside and he said, you always ask me if I have any questions. I said, yeah, that's a part of what I want to do as a professional. I want to make sure you feel very comfortable with everything that's happening. And I want to address any questions you might have. And he said, well, I usually do have questions, but I know you're busy, so I don't ask them. So, really, I'm like beating my head against the wall. It's like, I'm asking, do you have any questions? And I've made him understand. I said, don't worry about how busy I am. If you have questions, I want you always to feel free to ask them. So even me, this old dog, learned some new tricks in a sense that even asking the father if he had any questions and he says no, sometimes I'll say, you must have something that's on your mind. What can we talk about? I go a step further because I want them to feel really comfortable sharing what they're thinking and asking any questions that they may have. So it's something that I've learned in this process. They talk about having appointments and flexibility in terms of time of day for those appointments. Of course, they would love to have weekend appointments. That impacts, professional schedules, and not many of us are able to do that. Having extended hours where they can either come in early or come by late after work. Also having separate notification of appointments. And so again, this was a situation where the father is not always getting the information from the spouse. And so not sharing that there's an appointment coming up and not even telling the fathers. And these are some of the things that they want professionals to do in terms of being up to date with information, share advice and information right away, be more proactive about including fathers, and being unbiased in your recommendations. Other professional characteristics they would like to see that came out of the research, again, because of the time, and I want to leave time for questions, you see what they were recommending that professionals, in terms of how professionals behave, mainly just seeing the fathers as equal partners in all of this. And you see, we further broke it out in terms of providing parent education. What do these fathers want to see in terms of topics and areas of that they want to learn more about? And you see the list there. Another father's voice. We know that there are limits to this study. I mentioned having lots of families that were more in the middle class, looking to include other families from lower socioeconomic groups and from other ethnicities as well. And so we're planning to do more research. And this is something that I mentioned this to one of my colleagues. I said, it'd be interesting if the spouse would agree on the extent of the father's involvement. Would the spouse rate the father's involvement as highly as the father's would? And of course, my colleague said, are you trying to send all these couples to divorce because, having this one spouse rate the other? So that may not be something we look at. So just in summary, we know that about 90% of the parents that have kids with hearing loss are choosing spoken language outcomes. We need to be really family centered in our early intervention. We need to make sure that families hear all of the information about intervention, about hearing technology, and what it takes to be successful. And I hope you recognize the role that fathers have and can have, and some of the strategies or suggestions that the fathers mentioned from the results that maybe you can implement in the services that you're providing. So we're going to pause there, and we will we'll do some reflection. So what questions do you have about the research or anything that I've covered in the presentation?
So, thank you, Todd. This is Will Iserman. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is Will Iserman from NCHAM again. Thank you for all of that information that you've covered. Um, we are opening up the Q&A field now for people to type into their questions. So if you want to open that Q&A box at the bottom, um, that would be a great place to put your question. And Todd, how about I start off with a very challenging question to you?
Oh, thank you, Will. I appreciate that.
Okay, so you started off the presentation by talking about intact families,
Yeah.
with the idea of that being defined on the basis of biology. In a
Correct.
period where diversity of families is being increasingly honored, how can we perpetuate that definition? We consider adoptive families and families of parents who identify as LGBTQ.
Sure.
It seems like two parent families may reflect many of the differences and dynamics that you're ascribing to that second parent being a male.
Mhm.
Do you want to talk about that? Because obviously, empowering all of the adults in the lives of a child is this irrefutable value here.
Right. And so the point that I was trying to make, if you go back to those first few slides where I talked about how families are made up today, there's lots of different ways that families are coming together. And I think we are in a very unique time where we talk about gender roles and how we define gender. It's changing how we're looking at these issues for sure. The research, when they are using these terms, haven't caught up with how we're looking at families today. And so that's what I was saying in terms of that slide of intact and sort of not intact. That's how the research was defining it. And so that basically means we need to make sure that the researchers are more in tune to what's happening today in our society versus what has transpired over the course of the past couple of decades. So I agree with you 100% that we can't necessarily assign gender roles. I mean, and as I was saying, I have lots of friends, or some friends and students especially, that had single parent homes, and these are wonderful, well-adjusted people. So some of these issues that come from the research are, assumptions made based on the research that's happened over the past two decades or so.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that because I was thinking a lot about that during this myself and thinking about how your message of inclusion is so important
Right.
that we're including all of these key people in the child's life, but that message could end up alienating people who don't fit the predefined composition of an intact family.
Right.
And that qualification isn't made
Mhm.
in what you were just talking about. So I got kind of distracted by that. So I wanted to feed that back.
Sure. And I'll re-examine those slides again. But yeah, it's not the assumption that I'm certainly not saying that intact as it's defined by the research is what I would say is intact. I think we need to get away from that kind of terminology and recognize, as more or less the couple of slides in the beginning where I said that families come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and different blended families and all kinds of things. And it's really those people that sit around the same table in the evening. And so that's a bit removed from what we see in the research.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So the next question we have from our good friend Brant Culpepper. So pleased to see the knowledge base growing in terms of the impact of fathers on the development of kids in general and those with special needs specifically. What do you see as crucial next steps in research on impact of fathers and communication development.
I think, and hi, Brant, good to hear from you. I think what we need to do, what I would like to do is taking a step back when we look at how do we include parents in early intervention. And so is there a different way that we need to present information? Again, now you've made me really think about stereotyping, only having moms and dads in a family in terms of a parent unit. So what I'm getting at is we think about the sort of coaching process with early childhood education and early intervention and some of the materials that are out there. I think there is an assumption made that those materials are kind of designed for the professional working with the mother and coaching the mom. And so I'm wondering, Brant, to answer your question, do we need to broaden how we coach and work with fathers in that role, or other males for that matter, in terms of how that information is presented? Because it's sometimes presented of this is how you coach and you don't deviate from this. So that's one area that I would like to explore more in terms of what's the most effective coaching strategies and techniques for all families, regardless of how those families are comprised. So that's certainly one. I think this research looking at as Will is talking about how different family structures are being served within early intervention, I think would be a real great, interesting line of research to look at. Are there differences in terms of how families are viewed based on the structure of the family? Are assumptions made by the professionals going into those situations? Are there biases? There's lots of research right now on our own internal biases and what we bring to the table. And so are we having those biases when we work with certain families, but not with others? So I think there's a lot of research there that needs to continue looking at families, family structures, fathers, males in the child's life, all of those areas.
This is Will again with the next question. And this one is, do you have any information on how having a male early intervention provider affects fathers' feeling of involvement and satisfaction compared to a female provider?
Again, that could be another area of research. The problem with that is our fields of education and early intervention, even speech language pathology, my field, and audiology, they're dominant female, right? So it's females who go into these helping professions, and audiology just crossed that that majority limit now, or majority threshold of now more females are becoming audiologists than males. So the challenge would be is, can we find an equal number of male early interventionists who would be open to a study? So that's one thing that we would need to look at. I haven't seen any data specifically looking at the genders of the early intervention providers, male versus female, and the services and how their services are perceived. I certainly can say, as a male, I've had some great fathers that I've worked with, and I think there have been times where they probably felt a little more open in some situations talking to me as a male, or kind of, and it's just by experience. So I do think that can play a little bit of a role with some families and with some fathers.
This is Will again with the next question. And this reads, I wonder if you've surveyed early interventionists' views on the role of moms versus dads of children with deafness or who are hard of hearing, whether those data would have informed or influenced the way the research data were interpreted.
I haven't done it, but there's others who have looked at some of that already. So some of that data is out there within the field. There's not a lot of it, but there is some of it. And so I'm definitely looking at all of the data that's out there right now. It doesn't seem to sort of influence this data, but certainly it's something that we see a need, as we definitely need more research in those areas, and hopefully we'll see that research going forward.
Well, I think that this is Will again. It looks like those are all of the questions that have come in today, and I know people have been online now for almost 2 hours. So we want to thank everybody for your time, and Todd, of course, for all of the efforts that you've put into this and sharing your personal story and integrating that into your research, making for a very rich discussion of these really important issues on how we help support families of children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Another thank you to Sherry Dowling and the Maryland EHDI program for doing this collaboratively with NCHAM so that many people could benefit from this presentation today, and to our captioner and our two interpreters as well. We never want those folks to go unacknowledged because they're real live people who are working hard to help make these information sharing opportunities effective. And for all of the people in the wings who are supporting the technology of the delivery of programs like this. Remember that this is the second in a series of 3 webinars. This will be has been recorded and will appear on infanthearing.org in the next couple of days. So if you want to share this with someone else or review this again, that is a way to do that. And next week at the same time, we have the next webinar that you'll want to be sure to check out. So we will see you then. And again, thank you, everyone. As we sign off today, watch your browser as it will change to an evaluation for today's webinar. So have a check of that. Thanks again, Todd.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Good seeing you all.